So yeah, last panel of the day, we've made it successfully, and this last panel is going to be a treat. We have a very distinguished panel. It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce these members as we discuss proxy wars, security contractors, and military professionalism. So to lead off, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's Dr. Tony Pfaff, who's the research professor of the Profession and Ethic Strategic Studies Institute at the U.S. Army War College. Prior to joining the Army War College, he was served as a colonel with a long career as a foreign affairs officer, and his last assignment was working as the military advisor for the State Department under the Obama administration. Next to him is Colonel David Barnes, who's the Academy Professor for Philosophy at the U.S. Military Academy. Colonel Barnes is the Deputy Head of the Department of English and Philosophy, has a PhD himself in philosophy with numerous focus and writings on ethics of warfare, in addition to his military service. And then finally, Lieutenant General retired Christopher Miller, who served over 30 years in the U.S. Air Force with a long and distinguished career, many operational assignments, serving most recently before his retirement as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategic Plans and Policy, and now is currently at the U.S. Air Force Academy as the Helen and Arthur Johnson Chair for the Study of the Profession of Arms. And so combined, we have a very distinguished panel. It's very exciting to have them all here. And we'll go ahead and start off with Dr. Pfaff for our leader. Thank you.
Okay, here we go. Last panel. I kind of feel like I should just boil this down to proxy wars, ethics, happy hour. See you there. But I'll try to get through this as fast as I can. This was I took this topic up at the request of Ed Barrett, who asked, "Can I, talk about proxy wars and ethics at the McCain conference?" And I took it on. Almost 6 months later, and about 150 pages of monograph, which I've now condensed for this presentation down to 149. I'm going to kind of go real fast through kind of the range of things you would want to consider in dealing with proxy wars, and then yield my time to everyone else. But this is not, this is a very appropriate topic for a futures conference, because with growing assertiveness by regional state actors, increasingly capable non-state actors, and a war-weary American public, or at least a perceived war-weary American public, suggests the U.S. will place a greater reliance on international partners in securing its vital national interests. Such conditions will not only encourage these kinds of proxy relationships, but as the state and non-state challenges arise, encourage proxy wars as well. In fact, there's already a number underway. In places like Yemen, where the U.S. supports Saudi Arabia's efforts to contain Iranian influence. Syria, where the U.S., Iran, and Russia support different factions to achieve a variety of conflicting foreign policy goals. Iraq, where the government relies on militias to confront the Islamic State on its behalf. And Ukraine, where Russia backs a separatist movement ostensibly to protect Russian citizens, but more likely to keep Kiev off balance and prevent Ukraine's drift to the west. Now, what differentiates the ethics of proxy war from the traditional ethics of war are the additional considerations the benefactor must undertake, not only in establishing the justice of its cause, but also regarding the management of the moral hazards the proxy relationship entails. Since proxy wars are wars, moral analysis should start with the traditional provisions of jus ad bellum that include just cause, proportionality, right intention, right authority, public declaration, last resort, and reasonable chance of success, but also reflect the potentially corrupting influence the addition of the benefactor brings. So this is what I'm just going to work through. We'll talk a little bit about what is a proxy war, go through the jus ad bellum application, talk about how moral hazards arise and how to manage them, and just kind of sum up with a collection of norms that seem to have emerged in this analysis, useful for guiding efforts in proxy wars. So Andrew Mumford defines proxy wars as indirect engagement in conflict by third parties wishing to influence its strategic outcome. It is this indirect nature of the benefactor's involvement that distinguishes a proxy relationship from other supportive relationships, such as, for example, an alliance. Now, this point does not suggest that direct action by a benefactor is incompatible with proxy relationships. In Libya, for example, the international coalition provided support to rebel forces, while at the same time directly attacked Gaddafi's forces from the air. So while airstrikes did contribute to Gaddafi's defeat, the coalition limited its risk as well as its cost by supporting proxies on the ground that acted as a surrogate for forces the coalition would have otherwise had to provide. So it's this use of surrogates to replace rather than augment benefactor assets or capabilities that characterizes the proxy relationship. I also think not all the literature I reviewed actually have intentional as an aspect of proxy relationships, but I think it needs to be there because it's important when you're doing moral analysis, and as it is a critical factor in determining moral responsibility, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, but these conditions suggest two kinds of proxy relationships. One, where the proxy fights the benefactor wars in the benefactor's place. For example, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia's use of the Serbian Republic's army in Bosnia would be an example. And two, where benefactors enable proxies to fight to achieve some other goal that meets some other of the benefactor's interests. Examples would be U.S.'s early involvement in Vietnam or its support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which were both intended to curb expansion by the Soviet Union. Now, as these examples suggest, entering into such relationships creates massive opportunities for moral failure. These opportunities arise because the introduction of the benefactor complicates an already complex and somewhat subjective decision-making regarding the resort to war and introduces a corrupting influence that risks distorting the reasons that drive those decisions. Because benefactors are the ones who bring these moral complications, they bear the greater burden to address them. This point does not entail proxies have no responsibilities, of course, but what it does entail is that most moral decisions regarding proxy wars are often in the hands of the benefactor, without whom there would be no proxy relationship to judge. Now, proxy wars, as I've said earlier, like any other kind of war, must meet the requirements of jus ad bellum. The proxy must not only have a just cause, but meet the other requirements I described earlier. For some criteria, the proxy must fulfill them, for the most part, by itself. The intervention of a benefactor won't make an unjust cause just, an illegitimate authority legitimate, or a wrong intention right. In this regard, with perhaps one exception that I'll discuss later, we can consider these necessary conditions to justify benefactor involvement. However, the benefactor's involvement can potentially make the disproportionate proportionate, make alternative to fighting seem less appealing, impacting what counts as last resort, and certainly affect the proxy's calculations regarding its chances for success. This dynamic presents three morally relevant situations. Hold it there. I like to play with the animations. There's no rhyme or reason. So essentially these three situations are one where the potential proxy is already engaged in a war, it meets all the requirements of jus ad bellum, for whatever reason a benefactor wants to enter a relationship and support them. The other two, the proxy meets all the requirements, but will not initiate conflict without benefactor sponsorship. And then the third one is the proxy can't meet all of the jus ad bellum requirements without benefactor sponsorship. Now, the concern here, of course, is the role the benefactor plays in making the war come about. To the extent the war would have occurred otherwise, as in the first situation, then there seems to be fewer moral barriers to participation. If the proxy meets the just war criteria and decides on its own to fight, then the benefactor is simply joining an already just enterprise. If it's just to come to another's defense, it is just to come to that defense by proxy. Whether and what of these other criteria apply to the benefactor, I'll take up a little later. But since the war would have happened regardless of the benefactor's support, the benefactor did not affect the decision to go to war, and thus the support is not causally related, at least not in the same way it is in the other two situations, to the decision to go to war. The moral obligation for the benefactor in these situations, then, is to ensure that the just side wins with the least harm to either side caused. This point suggests that benefactor involvement that would prolong, widen, or increase the war's destructiveness would be impermissible, regardless of the justice of the proxy's cause or the benefactor's interest at stake. More problematic are the next two situations. One where the proxy does meet the criteria but does not fight absent the support of the benefactor, and the other one where the proxy cannot meet all the just war criteria without benefactor support. In both of these cases, the participation of the benefactor seems causally related to the proxy's decision to go to war in ways that it's not in the first. So, in the former, the proxy meets all the criteria, including ones related to resources like proportionality and reasonable chance of success. However, it chooses not to fight without benefactor support. We can imagine a number of reasons why that might be the case. They just want to lower their costs, culturally or politically risk averse, values the legitimacy an outside party might bring. In this case, however, the concern is that whatever the situation, the proxy did not feel the resort to war was worth it, absent whatever benefit the benefactor would bring. In such a situation, the benefactor plays a more causal role in bringing the war about. Given that it is usually better to avoid harm rather than cause it, even in the service of justice, the benefactors have to clearly establish that their involvement serves a greater good that overrides the proxy's reluctance to go it alone. War, while it might not be the worst thing, it should always be a necessary thing. Thus, in this situation, there's an extra burden on the benefactor to find alternatives to war. Now, it may still end up being the case that the injustice suffered by the proxy warrants the intervention, but the fact the proxy wouldn't fight, despite being permitted to enable, suggests that any benefactor should proceed with caution. Now, in the latter case, is different. The proxy has met the conditions it can, but not all the conditions it needs. In this situation, the proxy suffers from an injustice or aggression that would justify war, but it simply can't morally do anything about it because perhaps it can't fight proportionally or discriminately, or it doesn't have a reasonable chance of success on its own. In this situation, the proxy's choices are to suffer the injustice or to violate one or more of these other jus ad bellum or jus in bello conditions. In this case, the benefactor's intervention can make it possible not only for the proxy to address the injustice, but to do so justly. Now, doing so, of course, this is the obligation, would be a condition of the benefactor's participation, regardless of the benefactor's larger interests or other constraints. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. But it's obvious that benefactors and proxy interests, not only do they not have to align, they rarely do. But so the question then is okay, so when is that permissible? The application, to what extent does the benefactor's cause, interest, and intent have to align with the proxy's? If the proxy's war is just, does it matter why the benefactor provides support? The short answer is it depends, or probably, because those are the best kinds of answers. But I think it kind of turns on what kind of situation one is in. In the first situation, where the war happens regardless of benefactor support, then so long as the benefactor's motivating reason is at least morally permissible, then its support is likely as well. Moral hazards can arise when interests diverge, but I'll talk about that in just a second. Now, in other situations where the benefactor's support is a necessary condition for fighting, then it seems the benefactor's motivating reason to intervene must somehow relate to a cause of justice its intervention is supposed to address. For example, according to the National Security Strategy, the U.S. considers a strong, innovative, and growing U.S. economy and an open international economic system that promotes opportunity and prosperity as a vital national interest. It seems wrong, however, to enable a war to meet that interest. There's nothing wrong with pursuing it, of course. There's nothing wrong with it being realized collaterally as a side effect of an otherwise just war. It's just wrong to pursue it by force, so it can't stand as a reason to enable a war. On the other hand, this point does not entail that the benefactor must limit its interest to confronting a particular act of aggression. James Pattison, for example, argues that good effects such as preventing or mitigating gross human rights violations or humanitarian disasters or even ensuring a better peace can justify intervention even if the proxy cause is unjust. But one doesn't have to set the bar that so high. To see where to set the bar, it's useful to think in terms of sufficient and contributing causes, drawing from the work of Thomas Herka. Sufficient causes are those that fulfill the just cause condition associated with responding to an act of aggression. Contributing causes, on the other hand, do not fulfill the just cause condition, but are themselves causes of justice, which, given a sufficient cause, such as the proxies, should count as a justification for a proxy relationship. In this case, reasons such as deterring future aggression, upholding a just international order, and so on, or preventing human rights violations discussed, already mentioned, could be a contributing reason for a proxy relationship, even if by themselves they wouldn't justify war. Now, another interesting thing that arises out of proxy relationships is one of the advantages and motivating factors of the benefactor-proxy relationship can be the ability to keep the proxy relationship secret, as the U.S. attempted to do when it supported the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Given the requirement for public declaration, which not only allows the enemy to opportunity to address the injustice, but also one's own population to determine whether intervention is worth it, it raises a question, can keeping that relationship secret ever be permissible? On the surface, it would seem the answer would be no. Given the cost of war as well as the potential for escalation, it makes moral sense that a benefactor should also publicly declare its relationship. The concern here, however, is that sometimes that declaration can make escalation harder to manage or undermine the proxy's cause. For example, now this wasn't a proxy relationship, but we can imagine had the U.S. decided to work with the Green Movement in Iran. I don't believe that it did, and help it in its opposition to the Iranian government. Doing so, if that relationship had been public, would have undermined the movement's appeal and allowed the government to portray it as foreign. And it would have lost its grassroots nature that was contributed to success. In cases like this, particularly when causes of justice are at stake, it may make moral sense to keep the relationship secret. The problem with the U.S. relationship with the Sandinistas wasn't so much that the public declaration would have undermined their cause, it just would have subjected it to unwanted oversight, and that was the moral error. So even when a proxy relationship might benefit from secrecy, it still should be subject to some oversight process by representatives who can act on behalf of the population in order to fulfill at least the spirit of the public declaration condition. Now, third, in meeting proxy requirements, such as those necessary to meet the conditions of proportionality, reasonable chance of success, and last resort, these require judgments about future costs and alternatives that are difficult, if not impossible, to anticipate. The introduction of the benefactor can affect these judgments by appearing to reduce costs and provide additional capabilities that make the fight seem not only just, but also prudent. While doing so may appear to be the advantage of the proxy, the reality is often more complex. The difficulty is that benefactors can convey these advantages while at the same time unintentionally offsetting them. The introduction of a benefactor does not lower costs as much as it complicates their calculation. Given the propensity for escalation, frozen conflict, and diffusion inherent in proxy wars, it's hard to know, clearly demonstrated by events in Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere, how costly a conflict will be. Moreover, even without a benefactor, one can never know if one has tried all possible alternatives. Given the typical urgency of decisions to resort to war, however, the introduction of the benefactor is likely to make nonviolent but perhaps costly alternatives seem unattractive, making last resort more difficult to determine. Regarding reasonable chance for success, benefactors should intervene only with keeping proxy success in mind. While there may be good operational and political reasons to limit the kinds and quality and scope of assistance, as we've done in Syria, it makes no moral sense to provide proxies with insufficient assistance to meet their political objectives. Doing so just prolongs the fight and the suffering. Thus, for any assistance, there must be established causal connection to how it contributes to proxy success. Now, let's bring me to the last section that I wanted to talk about, moral hazards. The presence of a moral hazard does not directly impact the impermissibility of a particular proxy relationship. However, the failure to manage these hazards can effectively transform an otherwise permissible intervention into one that is impermissible. These hazards arise because of variations in benefactor and proxy interests, will, and capabilities, and can lead to divergent interests and optimistic estimates about the true cost of war that can drag both parties into a conflict they might otherwise have avoided. So the first one to talk about is divergent interests. Like I mentioned earlier, proxy relationships don't just make judgments to go to war more likely, they risk corrupting those judgments as well. Divergent interests inherent in any proxy relationship risk not only going to war to serve unjust ends, they also risk expanding the fighting as the parties involved attempt to realize multiple and sometimes exclusive goals. To make matters more complicated, as the chaos in Syria clearly demonstrates, benefactors and proxies never really know and sometimes misinterpret the other's interests and intentions. To the extent that divergence is not clear, both parties risk making bad judgments and commitments that could prolong the conflict and undermine the just cause for which it is fought. The remedy, then, is to align interests so that the realizations of the proxy should either realize the benefactor's interest as well, or at least lead to the end of the proxy relationship. Proxy relationships have sometimes been characterized as the cheapest insurance in the world. These relationships allow both benefactors and proxies to mitigate their costs while still addressing security needs, or so the theory goes. With this reduction in cost, however, often comes an increased readiness on both sides of the relationship to accept risk. For benefactors, the proxy's direct involvement allows them to address more distant security threats, especially when the urgency for benefactor direct engagement lags. But when the cost of the benefactor gets too high, benefactors are more likely to abandon the proxy to its fate. The best way to mitigate that effect of this moral hazard is for both sides to consider not just the total cost of the conflict, but the cost of the conflict if they had to wage it themselves. This point doesn't entail actors should only act if they can go it alone, but it does entail that they should consider if the consequences of bearing all the costs in the future is worth risking the cost of the current situation they're in. And even if it doesn't, it can still be permissible to proceed, but that decision rests on how trustworthy one perceives the other to be. Ethical decision-making doesn't have to be risk-free. Probably, one of the biggest concerns with proxy wars is, of course, escalation. One study concluded that in the 114 civil wars between 1946 and 2002, where at least 900 people were killed, no rebel group was transferred major conventional weapons without the government also receiving arms from an external source. This point suggests that escalation of proxy conflicts is more often the rule than the exception. The fact that proxy conflict escalates does not necessarily undermine the justice of the relationship or the cause. Given a just cause, the fault of the escalation arguably lies with the side that responded. Pattinson also notes, those facing violations of their basic human rights still retain their right of self-defense, irrespective of how others will react to that exercise. The remedy here is to ensure escalation dominance prior to any intervention. So, for example, it is likely that any lethal support for the Ukrainian government in its conflict with the separatists would result in escalation on the part of the Russians. If the potential benefactor is not prepared to match that escalation, then it should not start it in the first place. Related to that is the diffusion problem, which is when arms and lethal assistance provided to the proxies don't stay with the proxy. In fact, a lot of studies have shown that proxy relationships often lead in the aftermath to higher homicide rates, more violent crime, and further conflict. Probably the best example of the hazards associated with this concern was the spread of Stinger anti-aircraft missiles following the Soviet withdrawal in Afghanistan in 1989. After the conflict ended, these missiles were found as far afield as Bosnia, Iran, Kashmir, and Tunisia, and the Palestinian territories. To control this diffusion, the U.S. government initiated a $65 million buyback program, but only recovered a small fraction of the missiles. Now, there's no one way to manage this particular hazard, other than to say it's better to be proactive than reactive, and plan in advance how you're going to manage it. And finally, dirty hands. We see this concern with our relationship with Saudi Arabia and their operations in Yemen, where despite our intent and willingness to abide by jus in bello norms, the proxy doesn't always do that. The first response, of course, should be to withhold support. But sometimes, as in the case of Iraq's struggle against the Islamic State, doing so can lead to greater injustice. Walter, in his well-known article on the subject, argued that while we want statesmen to get their hands dirty on our behalf, there still needs to be some kind of accountability. So there's room, however unrealistic, for benefactor support for a proxy who fights unjustly, as long as the benefactor is somehow held accountable. More realistically, however, it's worth noting here that few wars of any kind are pure and clean. Our own forces from time to time commit war crimes. So it does not make any more sense to hold benefactors accountable for the actions of someone else's forces if they wouldn't be held accountable for the same actions of their own. But this point only holds as long as there's a reasonably good accountability scheme in place for those who do violate. So in recognizing that perfect compliance with the jus in bello norms is an elusive and unlikely goal, this analysis would permit a benefactor-proxy relationship when the following conditions hold: that the proxy leadership intends to abide by the jus in bello norms and hold violators accountable. A greater injustice will arise if the proxy fails than the injustice represented by the jus in bello violations of the proxy. And the benefactor also has to take extra measures to mediate the likelihood of any jus in bello violations. All right, to wrap up. Hopefully what I've been able to indicate is there are a number of measures that both the benefactor and proxy should take and norms to observe to ensure their war is just and its moral hazards are effectively managed. First among these is to ensure their causes, interests, and intentions align in ways that the benefactor's cause counts as a reason to enter into a proxy relationship and contribute to matters of justice. Of course, benefactors are permitted to consider non-contributing interests. However, they only count towards the overall prudence of the relationship. Absent a legitimate contributing cause, they are insufficient to justify a proxy relationship, absent some act of aggression that puts non-contributing interests at risk. Moreover, benefactor and proxy should align their interests so that the realization of the proxies realizes the benefactors. This alignment doesn't need to be complete. popular military, a PMF victory, Shia militia victory against the Islamic State in Iraq may not end the fight against the terrorist group. However, it should end the need for the proxy relationship, and the militia should either disband or be integrated into Iraq's existing security ministries. Such demobilization or integration is, of course, unlikely. The point here, however, is that when the proxy wins, the proxy relationship should transform into something that contributes to order rather than sets conditions for future chaos. Second, both parties must account for all the costs of the conflict, not just those to themselves. Moreover, they should include such estimates, future costs associated with escalation diffusion before deciding to go to war. And as discussed, cost projections are unreliable. Therefore, both parties must prepare in advance to favorably end any escalation and limit any diffusion of military assistance in the hands of other bad actors. Third, benefactors need to articulate a reasonable connection between the assistance they provide and the political objectives they and their putative proxies would achieve. Doing so ensures this assistance does not simply serve as fuel to an ever-growing fire. Destruction for destruction's sake rarely counts as a moral good. When determining those connections, benefactors should also make good faith efforts, not just to seek nonviolent solutions first, but to ensure those such options are, for such nonviolent solutions are always open. Now, even with these principles, standards, and rules of thumb in mind, the cases discussed here clearly demonstrate how morally perilous proxy relationships are. At the time of this writing, conflicts in Syria and Ukraine are frozen, yet escalating. Saudi operations in Yemen continue to implicate the U.S. and undermine its moral credibility, despite legitimate efforts to manage this particular moral hazard. Meanwhile, the complicated proxy relationships Iraqi Shia militias have with not just their own government, but the Iranian government as well, will continue to impede state consolidation, as well as profoundly affect implementation of U.S. security cooperation and assistance programs after Islamic State's defeat. The point here, however, is not to avoid such relationships, but rather establish, promulgate, and follow norms that treat partners as ends, not means, aligns interests with the greater good, and reduces the suffering these wars inevitably bring. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pfaff. Next, we'll have Colonel Barnes.
Quick disclaimer, the comments that I'm going to make are my own and don't reflect the Army or the United States government. But I blame Tony Pfaff for any mistakes that I make. So I told my children that I was coming down to the Naval Academy to talk about contractors. And they said, that's great. Are you going to talk about those guys on Call of Duty? Are you going to talk about that really cool movie, 13 Hours? No. I'm going to talk about my book. Oh. Good luck with that. I'm a colonel, so I like to tell stories. But I don't want to hold all the midshipmen here, as I'm sure that happens to many times. But I could talk a little bit about Checkpoint 2 in Iraq in 2004, where I was placing a sniper on top of the Al Rashid Hotel to overwatch the checkpoint. And much to my surprise, there was another sniper team already there. They were for Blackwater. I could talk about how the 4 contractors that were killed, their bodies mutilated and hung on the bridge in Fallujah, caused not one but 2 battles in the city of Fallujah, which resulted in both my unit participating in it, loss of some of my soldiers, as well as the almost complete destruction of that city at that time. I could talk about Blackwater Aviation, otherwise known as Ass Monkey, who were criticized for flying through the arches and kind of the wild hot dog sort of guys, but who saved my butt on a number of occasions. I could talk about those sort of stories, but as you know, when President Obama announced in 2010 that we were drawing down in Iraq, the first contractor war, as some people called it, was winding down. It was done. But I returned and I was interested in it, and I have studied philosophy, so I wanted to explore not just where these contractors came from, but why they might be different than mercenaries, as their proponents have argued. And more relevantly, had we spent any time studying what the ethical implications might be in terms of hiring them before we actually open Pandora's box? And so in my work, and shameless advertisement, you can get 20% off the ridiculously expensive but expertly written work. There's flyers in the back. I do trace the history of contractors all the way back to mercenaries of ancient times. I spent some time in the explication. Eisenberg says, you know, people spend time trying to sort out the definition of contractors and mercenaries. I mean, what a waste of time. That's just academic. Duh. And it's actually very important. If the proponents of private military contractors want to draw a distinction between them and the mercenaries of old to demonstrate why they're legitimate today, both morally and legally, then that definition, whoever defines it, is going to matter. And then I focus on three argumentative areas that I think are underexplored. The first is the commodification of force. I think that force should not be a commodity, but I think that traditional arguments against commodification fail. And I take that topic and look at the proponent's own argument about decreased costs and increased efficiency. Sneaky guys are using a consequentialist kind of reasoning. And I use that to argue why that force should not be a commodity, even though it's treated as such. The second major area I look at is a discussion rooted in the moral equality of combatants. Now, wherever side of the line you fall on in terms of a orthodox or the revisionist view of moral equality, it is clear that the contractors are not the moral equality of combatants, nor do they seem to be the moral equality of civilians. Even if you don't believe in the moral equality of combatants or you think that it's false, when we try to legally categorize them as either combatants or not combatants, I think that that fails as well. So I spent some time exploring that. Finally, I have a discussion about how the turn to privatization, in particular the use of armed contractors, has affected, may continue to affect the military as a profession today and in the future. But let me talk a bit about, since it's a conference about futures, where we are today and where we're headed. You see, private force never went away with the Treaty of Westphalia. It never went away with the rise of the nation state, the victory of the French over the Prussians. It didn't go away after World War II. We've always privatized to some extent, and by us, I mean all the major powers. And even after the drawdown in Iraq, they're still using private security contractors around the world. Here's an example. Right now we have between 3,500 and 5,000, depending on the numbers. We're kind of cagey about how many numbers we have in Iraq. But every time you hear about troop numbers, at least in recent history, the planning rule of thumb for contracting is 2.5 to 3 times that, and sometimes even more depending on the situation. And oh, by the way, that's only DoD contractors to support the DoD mission. Currently, there are 48,000 as of April this year contractors in the CENTCOM AOR, but those are all DoD contractors, both U.S. and local, national, and third country. That number does not capture DOS, DOJ, our allies, or anybody else who's using contractors. The reason I bring this up is the situation in the fight against ISIS is changing, and the new administration is faced with some important decisions about how we plan on tackling that, right? We hear that that problem is going to be solved, but is it going to be solved with boots on the ground, or as Doug Brooks, the former president of the ISOA, said, maybe the shoes on the ground versus the boots on the ground? Now, some have offered, why don't we use these private security companies as peacekeepers? Even Walter considered the idea. Look, if the international community is unwilling or incapable of solving a problem like Darfur, perhaps we can turn to a private company. Blackwater famously offered to be able to do that. But what about in Syria? Well, that's not really peacekeeping, right? It maybe be peacemaking. But one of the things that Eric Prince and others who support private military companies have argued that the reason they're different from mercenary companies is they don't do offensive operations, which are legal under current international law. Yet, here's our friend Eric Prince, who Peter Singer mentioned earlier today, said that if the old Blackwater team were still together, I have high confidence that a multi-brigade size unit of veteran American contractors or a multinational force could be rapidly assembled and deployed to be that necessary ground combat team. The professionals would be hired for their combat skills in armor, artillery, small unit tactics, special operations, logistics, and would serve as the pointy end of the spear, and would serve to strengthen friendly but skittish indigenous forces. We seem to be harking back to the days of executive outcomes and sandline. Now, we're not the only ones who use them. You know, I mean, our media is focused on it, obviously, and we've had our areas of concern in terms of individual contractual contractor conduct as well as the companies themselves. But Russia's using private military companies. RSB, not to be confused with the Royal Bank of Scotland, RBS. RSB is a Russian private military company that advertised on the web, right, that they will provide a full range of services, security services. We talked a bit about, my friend Tony talked a bit about proxy wars, right? And we heard about little green men from Dr. Brooks earlier. Josh Rogan, in his research, has theorized that the forces that took the 2 airports in eastern Ukraine might have actually been contracted forces, or hybrid forces of contracted forces and special operations, as well as the proxy forces. Right? So this is not just becoming a one-off. It's becoming more widespread. What about our friends in China? Well, in 2012, in a study, there were over 847,000 Chinese that were working for over 16,000 Chinese companies internationally. And they need security. Our friend again, Eric Prince, helped form a company called Frontier Services, and it was designed to be able to research and provide security training and consulting around the world. That company is actually on the Hong Kong Exchange. And as Dr. Singer mentioned in his discussion today, Eric Prince, there's some discussion, sort of in the background, that he is looking at working with China to provide security consultation and training for them as well. Nigeria, the fight against Boko Haram. Eric Prince had made a proposal to the Nigerian government to offer to train and perhaps augment and fight there. Allegations, at least open source in the newspapers, are that, in fact, there are mercenaries and provided by another organization, a competitor of Eric Prince's company, in the fight in Nigeria. And it's not just states. Non-state actors are using it. NGOs. Let me give you a hypothetical. There's been a lot of talk concerning the refugees in the war against Syria. And it's been a terrible tragedy. And it will continue to be until it's resolved. Let's say that you are a very affluent individual. You and your wife have donated not hundreds of thousands, not millions, but up to $1 billion. Bill and Melinda Gates see this tragedy on TV unfold and decide that they too should do something about it. Coincidentally, there happens to be a company offering their services on the market. It doesn't seem that that's much beyond the scope of possibility, does it? Pirates, ARG, they still exist. And the statistics, it's not just what we've seen with Captain Phillips off the coast of Somalia. The statistics even in the Singapore Strait, one of our major sea lanes, right? Yeah, cool. Increase in piracy of over 700% in 5 years. Now, many of these countries, their navies are small. Perhaps having a private maritime security company might be a viable option for them. Back in the day, Blackwater had its own maritime security services company, a subsidiary of it, actually refit a frigate named MacArthur to offer it back on the open market to provide anti-piracy security. This is not going to change. The problem with piracy, though, even if it seems like a great idea for some of these smaller countries, Micronesia or something like that, UNCLOS, right, the UN Convention, thank you. Convention on the Law of the Sea. I mean, it's unclear what the status of pirates are, especially when you have pirates like the ones in Somalia that are operating off coast. When they get into territorial waters, are they still considered pirates? What about the private security companies, ones that aren't a party, right? If they're not tied specifically to one of the states, do they even fall under international law? So there's lots of things to be worked out even in that case. I want to talk, before I get to my recommendations, I want to talk about one thing that I think that in spite of all these neat, potentially frightening concerns that people may have of the private military companies and their use around the world, is the fact that there really is not a good system designed, even here in the U.S., to track and treat contractor casualties. From 2003 to 2015, there were 3,481 U.S. contractor KIAs in Iraq alone. There are no good statistics for non-U.S. contractors killed in Iraq. That number was not done by the U.S. government. That was another private organization that has taken the time to try to be able to track it. David Finkel in his book, Thank You for Your Service, and his others, Good Soldiers, talks about 20% of returning veterans from OIF, OEF have PTSD. Is there a similar number of contractors? If their health care isn't prescribed by the contract, we have no ability to ensure that they're getting adequate care, that their families are being taken care of. Back to 13 hours. Okay, I can tell my kids I did talk about it. The ones that are in service of the U.S. government, do we honor them for the service that they're doing? Or are we honoring them because they are former veterans, former Navy SEALs, other people? There was a strong surge of support for them. Flag-draped coffins. If they were in the military, we'd give them medals. How are we going to treat them in the future? And if you have interest in the Q&A in terms of recommendations and whatnot, of course, buy the book, but I'll certainly answer your question after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Barnes. I'll put a plug in that we reviewed the book actually as part of our ethics seminar this year. It's quite good, so I also recommend taking a look at it if you can. Lastly, General Miller, and because we started a little bit late, we'll go just a few minutes later beyond our deadline to capture remarks and then open up for Q&A.
No, we probably won't. I'm happy to push it up a little bit. Let's see, that's working. Okay, great. Congratulations on your endurance, those of you who are hanging in here on a Friday afternoon. We've talked a lot about the ethics of future conflict. Many of you are ethicists. We've talked about future scenarios, but I'm going to change gears just a little bit as the last pitch of the day and talk not about the scenario or the ethics, but about the people involved in actually executing whatever operations we talk about. And it's my disclaimer, what I'm about to say is my opinions, and it's my opinions based on a huge 21 days in my current position. I'm still deep into literature review, but I'm bringing about 42 years worth of wearing the uniform of the nation or being associated with it. So I'm trying to blend in the work that I'm getting ready to undertake two streams. One, practical experience with soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and the other, the great amount of scholarship and thinking that's been done about the American profession of arms. So we are convinced out at the Academy, and this slide will not floor anybody. This is pretty straightforward stuff, that we've got some changes that need to be taken into account and probably need to be applied to our conception of the profession of arms. Thomas Schelling said to have asked three questions to which the answers matter when you're trying to determine whether or not there's been a paradigm shift. The first question is, who are the players? Second question is, what can they do to each other? And the third question is, what do they wish to do to each other? And I would submit that since much of the seminal writing on the profession of arms was done back in the late 50s, early 60s, the answers to those questions have changed in the areas that you see there. From a societal standpoint, you got millennials with an approach to life that's different from previous generations, although a lot of it's the same. You got some shifting demographics. You've got less traditional social structures, certainly in our country and in others, even as you have some traditional structures reasserting themselves. You've got the rise of multilateral conversations and institutions, some of which are effective, some of which are not. Rise of populism, evolution of conflict, much as George Friedman sketched out yesterday, and economic trends, which we could talk about. They may be cyclical, but one thing that applies to every category I've got up on that slide is that our visibility of them, whether or not it's accurate, whether or not it's deep, is much greater than it has been in the past. the relationship of people to their government and other governments and to their people groups. The awareness that people have crossing national boundaries is growing. From a technical standpoint, we've talked about autonomy, we've talked about human enhancement, cyber, advanced weapons, WMD, adversary capabilities. And from an operational standpoint, the forces that we have in this country are facing a persistent increase in the likelihood of conflict with insurgent and non-state actors, combined with, like Peter Singer talked about today, no decrease really in the likelihood or consequence of state-to-state conflict. So the challenges that the midshipmen in this room have to prepare for are more complicated than those of us who came in when we could be cold warriors and call it good. In other words, it's an and world, not an or world. And from an organizational standpoint, affecting our profession of arms, we've seen a definite rise in the importance and relevance of our guard and active components in the conduct of operations, and I don't think that's going away. We've seen an accretion of new missions. We tend in the American military to say we can do, and therefore we get to do. And because of the nature of our political process, both bureaucratic and representative, once a mission is established, once a base is established, once those things are put in place, it's very difficult to make them go away. And that's made even more difficult by the fact that we have a professional military and not a military that depends on mobilization and primarily a conscripted force where people come into the military from society and return to society and sometimes take with them some of those organizations and ways of thinking that had been built during the buildup. So my contention is we've been adding cars to the train, all kinds of different passengers and cargo to the train, to the cars, but the profession of arms train is in some very important respects on the same rails it's been on for a long time. Our services, for all kinds of good reasons, which I subscribe to and love emotionally, have very long, very distinctive traditions, but some of those may not be helpful for us. This is a quote from Lieutenant General Sir John Winthrop Packett, who gave some fairly famous lectures in the early 60s. He clearly reinforced the view of the profession as being oriented toward the ordered application of force. And we spent some time debating in the last couple of days what force looks like, soft war, hard war, and others. My classmate, General Selva, yesterday mentioned that he views the purpose of our military as witnessing unspeakable violence on our enemies. And yet, I think there are a lot of things that we would all acknowledge our military forces do that don't necessarily even indirectly result in that happening. Okay, I said I was going to be quick, so I'm going to push it up here. We talked a little bit about pictures. Those happen to be as you walk in the stairs on the way up. I could have thrown in a picture of B-17s from World War II. I could have thrown in a picture of the Normandy beaches, but we all kind of instinctively get that is what the profession of arms is about. It's people in tough circumstances doing hard things with people that they love to protect their brothers and sisters from people who wish them harm. But that emotion, as I said, may not be that helpful. So to reinforce it, General Sir John Hackett's lecture, this is an image we can all kind of identify with. It's the knight with a charter from his sovereign, with a sword and shield defending those that he cares for. However, I asked a friend of mine, so what would that look like in today's world? And I got kind of a whimsical response. But there's a little more truth to that, maybe, than we want to admit, because our force is much more complicated than the sword and shield and the horse, whether it's an armored vehicle, a vessel on or under the sea, or an aircraft. Most everybody, I think, could identify with this, and membership in past times has seemed fairly dichotomous, and I think it's becoming less so. There's plenty of writing on this, and I was going to spend a little time running through Sam Huntington, Morris Janowitz, Charles Moskos, Don Snyder. I don't think, as good as these works are, any of them really address exactly the conundrums we're dealing with today. Huntington said we have corporateness as a military, as a profession. We have responsibility and a special expertise, which he defined as the management of violence. He considered the profession to be made up only of officers. And we've certainly blurred the distinctions in terms of education and even in responsibility. He considered that the model of civil-military relations we should follow was an objective model, which kept the military relatively separate and apolitical. Janowitz, on the other hand, looked at measured application of force, which you could argue is more appropriate for what we've seen over the last couple of decades. He saw the profession as much more reflective of the society that it serves and from which it comes. His definition was more inclusive than the officer corps, but he and Charlie Moskos, no one actually included as many people in the service and the common language as all of our services now tend to do, where service civilians, service enlisted members, service officers are, in general parlance, considered to be part of a profession. I don't think that's necessarily wrong at all. Whether or not they are members of the profession of arms is something that I think should be studied and better understood than it is. Don Snyder, last of the authors I'll talk about very briefly, has done some great work to define the Army profession, and one of the things that he has said that I think bears a great deal of validity and weight as we're going forward is that he considers professionals to be those who are associated with the repetitive exercise of discretionary judgments of high moral content. And that is something that you can apply to the cyber world. That is something you can apply to things other than kinetic destruction of a target. But it still doesn't quite, in our view, get to it. And I would just real quickly reinforce, I'm going to skip through these slides so you don't have to read them. This is a Marine Corps vision. This is from the Army's definition of expertise. Both of them, again, tend to exclude explicit discussion of the kinds of force and the kinds of scenarios we've been talking about here for the last couple days. So I want to talk a little bit about what I'm really interested in studying and what I would encourage and ask for any thoughts or inputs that you may have. Colonel Barnes talked about contractors. I personally served with air traffic controllers, for example, who wore the uniform of the United States Air Force, and right next to them were contractors performing the exact same duties in a combat zone. One group carried sidearms, the other did not. Sometimes you ask yourself, so if we're a profession, why are both of these kinds of people doing exactly the same thing in exactly the same place? And it goes to identity. If you're flying satellites at Schriever Air Force Station, you're in charge of the GPS constellation. Your output certainly does support the point of the sword when it comes to delivering weapons, but there are literally millions of people who depend on you doing your job as the way that they get the signal that tells them where to turn on their iPhone. They have an impact on national security, but the question is, while they may be professional, is that something that is inherently part of the profession of arms? RPA operators are often included in this discussion, but I would actually argue that they are probably the closest of the new and sort of notable career fields that really do have a lot to do with the profession of arms, because often what they do results in the delivery of a warhead on a target. So they are very much associated with the management of violence. But the real question, when you look at all those faces, all those scenarios in which people contribute to the national security, I go back to, we have a historical, emotional conception of the profession of arms. I'm not sure, based on the last couple of days, any one of us could give a really good definition of arms, what those are today. I mean, there's a dictionary definition, But when it comes to training young men and women to join a lifestyle, to join an organization that involves potential sacrifice of life and the taking of life, I think the idea of defining that identity more clearly than it is today is worth continued exploration. And I'll give you one other example why, when you have a military organization that has people of all kinds of specialties involved, our symbols are important. If you remember, in 2013, Secretary Panetta approved something called the Distinguished Warfare Medal for those who were going to employ force remotely in support of combat operations. That medal didn't live for very long before Secretary Hagel rescinded it. And I think what it says is that we need to talk about what constitutes arms. So I'm going to close here, and I went over what I said I would do, but not by a whole lot. Rosa Brooks today said that violence itself is facing competition as a means of exerting influence. In the context that I'm most interested in, which is understanding and refining the definition of the profession of arms and the people who serve and especially lead in it, if we don't know what arms are, if we don't know where they're going to be employed or who's going to be employing them with some more precision than we do, we're not doing the service to the young folks joining this military that we need to. There is hope, and I just feel like showing you this picture because I can. This is the inauguration. It says a lot about our young men and women out at the Character and Leadership Center at the Academy. These folks were in a seminar doing their thing, learning about being good cadets, and as the president's address, new soon-to-be inaugurated president, began to give his address, the folks teaching him let him out into our central forum, and cadets being cadets, they sat there and listened respectfully, and I had to laugh as the invocation ended, and the Marine band got ready to play the national anthem. You could kind of see the bubbles over the heads. Okay, are we watching TV, or are we actually witnessing something big? And without command, they all stood, and we're at attention for our national anthem, which to me says a couple things. One is sometimes we overthink these things, but we want to be able to give people a clear conception of why they will stand regardless of who's being inaugurated, why they will stand for the symbol of their nation, why they will go fight for it, and who they fight alongside, and for what purpose. And when they think about their identity as soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, members of a profession of arms, what I'm kind of here to say is I appreciate any thoughts you have on this topic. I'm going to be collecting for the next couple of years. We're serious about looking at it because I think what people take as their most central identity as servants of the nation is really, really important, and we got a little work to do to refine it for them. So with that, I'm out. Thanks.
Thank you, General Miller. Since we're over, why don't we just take 5 minutes just for a couple quick questions, and then we'll just spend the rest of our time. You can follow up with the panelists immediately afterwards. Yes?
Chris, I wanted to ask you, there are folks like Charlie Dunlap, for instance, who question this expansion of military functions and tasks, who believe that the more you expand that, the more sort of compromise of what you think of as these traditional warfighting functions. I wonder what your thinking is on that, whether you think that perhaps ideally the scope of responsibilities should be narrower than it is, and even if you think that, do you think that nonetheless it's almost inevitable that it's going to continue at least to be as expansive as it is, and perhaps extend?
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. That's a great question, Matt. I think the institutional dynamics would say that it's likely to stay as it is or expand. And I'm trying not to rush to a conclusion as I think about this. My sense is that if we were being completely logical, we would do one of two things as a result of looking at this definitional question. One is figure out a way to recharacterize the purpose of the profession from management of violence to something more expansive but still meaningful. So mastery of lethal competition. You can't say state to state because some of the actors aren't states, but it would be something like that where it's not simply violence, it's a national security output. Not nearly as inspirational as the man on the horse, but perhaps accurate. The other alternative would be to say, no, our cyber warriors who directly support the employment of force, maybe those folks are members of the profession, but maybe the folks who defend the networks aren't. And then you get into a whole litany of things. Well, if that's true, then why are the folks who pump fuel into airplanes and ships part of the profession? So I think, like Rosa Brooks was talking about, a lot of this is categorization and characterization, but I'm fairly confident that if you don't either clarify or discard those functions that aren't truly part of the profession of arms, then perhaps that term stops having any real meaning other than as a historical artifact.
Had a question back here, Scott?
I'm Scott Cooper. I'm a retired Marine, and I really took to your point about the contractors. Someone that is killed as a Blackwater contractor is not draped in a flag draped coffin. We have an exaggerated respect today. We're kind of in that thank you for your service moment where, as veterans, we're, better looking, braver, kinder than we actually are. And we've seen that in this new administration, where we perhaps have an exaggerated role of the military profession. What's the greatest threat to that, and what can we do to preserve the respect that I would submit has probably been earned, but there might be an exaggerated sense of that today?
No, that's a great question. I think it's broader than just the contractor piece, right? I think it really gets to General Miller's discussion about defining or redefining and getting our arms around the profession. I think part of what may be motivating it, perhaps even unconsciously, is a response to this idea that we in the military don't necessarily want to be thanked. We think that the things are going overboard. Certainly like to get a discount and whatnot, because what it means is that it almost belittles the work that we've done, and then our comrades who have lost their, made the sacrifice and lost their lives along the way. And I think what's critical to that, which is the glue that holds us all together, is the trust. All right, we provide a service for the nation. I think it's a very specific service. I think that we can, as the military, be asked to do other things, but that in no way should diminish the focus on providing that service, which is to fight and win the nation's wars. And the public still trusts us, right? I mean, annually the Harris poll comes out and we're still near the top of the list. If that starts dropping in some dramatic way, right? If it's indications of whether it's senior leaders and indiscretions or other choices, or it's been seen as a widespread, perhaps it could be, back to the contractors, a turn away from performing security for the country as part of a public good, and there's some sort of private motivation involved with it that somehow takes that away. I think that will begin to erode the trust, and I think that's of a broader concern for all of us.
So I see the midshipmen forming on the plane, so I believe that's our final bell there. But before we before concluding remarks from Colonel Athens, join me in thanking the panel. Thank you very much.
So the only reason I came back up here is here at the Naval Academy, we never let West Point and Air Force have the last word. So I just want to thank everyone for being part of this two-day conference, participants, panelists, guest speakers. I want to thank the staff one more time for all that they did. I think we have a great challenge in front of us. It's easy to leave one of these conferences and just go on to the next thing. But this perhaps is too important to just go on to the next thing without really considering individually
what is our responsibility? What's the one thing we need to do in the place we are to influence perhaps the thinking of the future or considering how we approach it from an ethical leadership standpoint? And I think if we do that well, there's going to be a lot of these future young officers that are going to be very thankful that we've done that. So I hope you've enjoyed your time here in Annapolis. Safe travels as you head back. And one more time, thank you for your participation. God bless you. Thanks.